Good evening. Tonight I'd like to talk to you about the last part of the second book of the Republic. We're going to skip book 3 and then talk about book 4. Now, we saw that in the second book of the Republic, we had two accounts of justice, two competing accounts of justice. The first one is put forward by Glaucon, and here the account of justice is that it is a social contract. So it's a social contract theory of justice. And in this social contract theory of justice, justice is something that is the result of human agreement. It is not loved for its own sake, but only for its consequences. Now, the second account of justice is the account that is going to be put forward by Socrates. This kind of justice is loved both for its own sake and for its consequences. Earlier in the second book, we saw that we had an experiment where we were trying to isolate justice to see if it could be something that could be loved for its own sake. So we had an experiment where all of the consequences of justice were removed to see, again, if once those consequences were removed, justice could be loved for its own sake. Now, it is to Socrates' account of justice that we now turn. At 366e, Socrates is asked to demonstrate what justice and injustice are, each by itself. What does each by itself do to the soul of the individual? And we're looking what it does to the soul of the individual independently of the consequences. So we see here that reputations are not to be taken into account. Now, as a result, in answer to this question, Socrates comes up with the story of the big and the small letters. This is the analogy, the famous analogy, between state and soul. And so, at 368d, Socrates tells us, so, since we are not very clever people, I think we should adopt the method of investigation that we would use if, lacking keen eyesight, we were told to identify the small letters from a distance, and then noticed that the same letters existed elsewhere in the larger size and on a larger surface. We would consider it a godsend, I think, to be allowed to identify the larger ones first and then to examine the smaller ones to see whether they are really the same. So the idea is that the small letters is justice in the soul. The large letters is justice in the city. It is the same justice that exists in the city, that exists in the soul. So if we can find it in the city, we can later find it in the soul. So now we're going to see Socrates' construction of the city. And he's going to divide the city into 3 principal groups. The first group is going to be the producers or the artisans. They are the producers of goods, services. They also lend money. They're producers of necessities and pleasures for the body. Okay? The second group are going to be the soldiers. They're also called the auxiliaries, and they defend the city. They are like well-trained dogs, we are told. So this is very important, this idea that the soldiers are like well-trained dogs. And the third group is going to be the smallest. So the producers are the largest group, the soldiers is the second largest group, and the leaders are going to be the smallest group. They are the best educated, and they love the city and care for its welfare. Again, the idea is that the justice that we find in the city is analogous to the justice we will find in the individual soul. And notice that this strategy was already hinted at in the first book at 352a. One of the big problems of the Republic is to try to make sense of the grounds for this analogy and to ask whether it is a valid one. What might be the grounds for this analogy? Well, it seems that each of the groups, the producers, the soldiers, and the leaders, when we try to distinguish between them, what we see is that the persons in each of the group are characterized by having a dominant desire. So why are the producers producers? It has to do with their dominant desire, with what they care the most for. And what is it that they care the most for? They care the most for the necessities and pleasures of the body. The soldiers have a dominant desire as well. They care most about honor and glory. They will be caring about the honor of the city as well. So they are the defenders of the city. The leaders, they are going to be the ones that engage in deliberation. So they care the most about wisdom and how to arrive at correct decisions. Now, if the city is good, it's going to possess the virtues. And there are 4 virtues that Socrates identifies. These are wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. He's going to look for the first 3, and then after having found those, that will help him to identify what justice is. The first of these virtues is wisdom, and we find that discussed at 428d. There Socrates tells us, then is there some knowledge in the city we have just founded, which some of its citizens have, that does not deliberate about some particular thing in the city, but about the city as a whole, and about how its internal relations and its relations with other cities will be best possible. So that again tells us what the function of wisdom is. It has a dual function. On the one hand, it regulates the internal relations within the city, and on the other hand, it also regulates how the city is going to behave with respect to other cities. So then wisdom is not about any one particular thing, but is about the city as a whole. We next proceed to courage. The discussion of courage begins at around 429b. And so here, this is what Socrates tells us. So courage too belongs to a city because of a part of itself, because it has in that part the power to preserve through everything its belief that the things and the sorts of things that should inspire terror are the very things and sorts of things that the lawgiver declared to be such in the courage of educating it. Or don't you call that courage? So again, we saw that wisdom is going to belong to the leaders of the city. And it is the leaders who have some kind of capacity for knowledge. They can deliberate, they can think, they can reason, and try to understand what is in fact best for the city, and what is in fact best for the city in its relations with other cities. The soldiers, on the other hand, or the auxiliaries, are going to have the virtue of courage. And so let me continue reading here. Socrates says, I mean that courage is a sort of preservation. What sort of preservation? The preservation of the belief inculcated by the law through education about what things and what sorts of things inspire terror. And by its preservation through everything, I mean preserving it through pains, pleasures, appetites, and fears, and not abandoning it. I will compare it to something I think it resembles, if you like. And he continues, you know then that when dyers want to dye wool purple, they first select from the wools of many different colors, the ones that are naturally white. Then they give them an elaborate preparatory treatment so that they will accept the color as well as possible. And only at that point do they dip them in the purple dye. When something is dyed in this way, it holds the dye fast, and no amount of washing, whether with or without detergent, can remove the color. But you also know what happens when things are not dyed in this way, when one dyes wools of other colors, or even these other white ones without preparatory treatment. And importantly, Socrates continues, you should take it then that we too were trying as hard as we could to do something similar when we selected our soldiers and educated them in musical and physical training. It was contrived, you should suppose, for no other purpose than to ensure that, persuaded by us, they would absorb the laws in the best possible way, just like wool does a dye, that as a result, their beliefs about what things should inspire terror and about everything else would hold fast because they had the proper nature and rearing, so fast that the dye could not be washed out even by those detergents that are so terribly effective at scouring. Pleasure, which is much more terribly effective at this than any chalestrian or alkali, and pain and fear and appetite, which are worse than any detergent. So what does this mean? In contrast to those who are the leaders and have wisdom and can deliberate, the soldiers only have true belief. They do know, or they don't know, they have an idea of what should inspire terror, but they don't have knowledge. This has been inculcated within them like a dye, through the emotions, through physical training, through music. So again, the emotions of the soldiers have been inculcated for them to love the correct things and defend the city. But the soldiers, insofar as all that you have is true belief, that is not yet knowledge. So that is a very important distinction between knowledge and true belief, which we already see in this distinction between wisdom on the one hand and the virtue of the auxiliaries, which is courage, on the other hand. So now what about temperance? At 430e, Socrates tells us that temperance is surely a sort of order, the mastery of certain sorts of pleasures and appetites. People indicate as much when they use the term self-mastery, though I do not know in what way. And then just skipping down to 131a, he says, it seems to me, however, that what this term is trying to indicate is that within the same person's soul, there is a better thing and a worse one. Whenever the naturally better one masters the worse, this is called being master of oneself. At any rate, it is praised. But whenever, as a result of bad upbringing or associating with bad people, the smaller and better one is mastered by the inferior majority, this is blamed as a disgraceful thing and is called being weaker than oneself or being intemperate. So the idea of temperance then, he's going to describe it as a kind of harmony between the parts. What kind of harmony is this? It is a harmony where the rulers and the ruled are unanimous about who does the ruling. What does that mean? In other words, the better kinds of desires, which would be what rule the soul in a temperate soul, and the worst are ruled, so they are controlled. So temperance is a kind of self-control. He uses the word self-mastery. It is the control of the baser desires by the higher desires. The discussion of justice begins at 433b, and there he's going to tell us that justice is doing one's own work and not meddling with what is not one's own. So this is very important. The idea here is that what justice is that each member or each part does its own work and minds its own business. That's at 433d. Not only does each part do its own work in the just city, but each part also gets its due. So there we are back to the idea of justice as giving each person his or her due. So here it's going to be justice in the city is that each of the kinds of parts of the city or the groups of people in the city, each of them is going to do their own work and not usurp the function of another part. And when it does its own work, when each part is doing its own work, and the whole city is functioning as well harmoniously because of this justice, each part is also going to get its due. Now we have to think further what this actually means. Remember that we talked about the parts of the city as groups within the city, groups of people in the city. And these groups are characterized by their dominant desire. So let's look at the producers. The producers are people whose dominant desire has to do with producing the needs, producing things for the needs and pleasures of the body. So they are mostly concerned with the body. They know how to produce the necessities and things for the pleasure of the body, and because they know how to produce these things because they are aware of what those things are. They also enjoy them. So now, what happens if those people with those kinds of dominant desires having to do with the body begin to become aggressive? Well, there you begin to have injustice, because these people are going to be simply trying to get more things, to make war to get more things. So there you have disorder in the city when these people with this dominant desire, right, usurp the function of the soldiers. In the just city, the soldiers have been properly trained. They have the proper emotions, and they are going to be guided by the leaders who have wisdom and know when it is the right time for war and when it is not the right time for war. Now, when I talk about a dominant desire, what I mean is that you have this one thing that a person wants to do, and all of their other activities and all of their other desires are put in the service of that one thing. So the producers are again mainly concerned with the things of the body. The auxiliaries are going to be mainly concerned with honor and the honor of the city. And the leaders are again concerned with wisdom. In the just city, again, the auxiliaries are concerned, they have absorbed the laws like a dye, as we said. They have the proper emotions, and they are willing to be guided by the leaders. The leaders then are going to, their dominant desire is going to be the search for wisdom and deliberation. So in the just city, each part does its own work and does not usurp the function of the other. That means that the kinds of individuals with certain kinds of dominant desires are limited to the work that they're supposed to do. The producers, they're guided by appetite. They want things. They're concerned with pleasures. They're not doing the work of the auxiliaries. They're not doing the work of the leaders. They're not usurping the work of the leaders. So what happens in an unjust city? So one example would be when those who are the producers, whose dominant desires have to do with appetite. It has to do with producing and enjoying the things of the body. If the people with that kind of dominant desire become the leaders of the city becomes disordered. Because then whatever deliberative function there may be just becomes the slave of that dominant desire of getting more and more things. So that city becomes unjust because the only thing that is driving that city is the getting of more and more things and enjoying more and more things, and then using, for instance, the auxiliaries or the soldiers in order to plunder and conquest other cities, so that your city can have more and more things. That's an unjust city. In a just city, on the other hand, those producers do their own work. They don't go beyond production. They don't start being aggressive. right? But they are under the control of the auxiliaries and the leaders. Importantly, as I said before, in the just city, each group of people with each kind of dominant desire gets its due. So the producers are not starved. They're going to be able to enjoy some of the pleasures, but it's within limits. So again, that is the just city. And in our next lecture, we'll be looking at justice in the soul.